Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. A man who has everything will eventually discover that the rarest thing in the world cannot be bought. Adrian Whitmore had spent the last 10 years proving that money could solve almost any problem. At 34, he was the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Logistics Group, a company whose delivery trucks crossed every major highway in America before sunrise, and whose technology had quietly changed the way millions of packages reached front doors every single day. Business magazines called him a visionary. Investors called him unstoppable. Social media called him the country's most eligible bachelor. Adrian called it exhausting. On a crisp October evening in Manhattan, the ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, where soft jazz floated through the air and every polished marble floor reflected gowns worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Cameras flashed every few seconds as celebrities, executives, and influencers greeted one another with carefully rehearsed smiles. Tonight's charity gala had only one unofficial purpose everyone seemed to care about: finding out whether Adrian Whitmore would finally choose someone. Rumors had spread for weeks that 8 internationally recognized fashion models had accepted invitations to the same event. Each woman was breathtaking in her own way, elegant, confident, and perfectly aware that every camera lens eventually found Adrian. One after another they approached him with effortless charm. One complimented his recent business expansion. Another joked about finally convincing him to take a vacation. A third suggested they should collaborate on a charity campaign together. Adrian remained respectful, offering warm smiles, brief conversations, and sincere gratitude before politely excusing himself every single time. His assistant Ethan watched from across the room before finally walking over with an amused grin. "You're breaking hearts at a record pace tonight." Adrian chuckled quietly without taking his eyes off the ballroom. "They're impressive women." "Then what's the problem?" Ethan asked. Adrian slowly lifted his glass of sparkling water, but never took a sip. "Everyone here already knows who I am before they know anything about me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's the price of success." Adrian looked around the room again. Luxury watches sparkled beneath expensive suit sleeves. Diamond necklaces caught the light. Conversations drifted toward investments, private islands, exclusive clubs, and market forecasts. Everything looked flawless. Everything sounded empty. He had attended hundreds of events exactly like this. Different city, different ballroom, different faces. Always the same conversations. Always the same expectations. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped wondering whether anyone actually saw Adrian the man instead of Adrian the billionaire. The master of ceremonies soon invited Adrian onto the stage to thank him for funding another nationwide scholarship program for working families. The audience applauded enthusiastically as he delivered a short speech about opportunity, perseverance, and giving back. His words were genuine, yet even while speaking, his attention drifted toward the massive windows overlooking the rain-soaked streets below. Tiny headlights crawled through Manhattan traffic while delivery scooters weaved between yellow taxis. Ordinary people were still working long after sunset. Somehow, that world felt more real than the one applauding him inside this ballroom. When the gala finally ended nearly an hour later, Adrian slipped out through a quieter side entrance, hoping to avoid another wave of interviews. Cool rain greeted him immediately. His driver opened the door of the black SUV just as traffic ahead came to a complete stop because of construction. "Looks like we'll be sitting here for a few minutes, sir," the driver apologized. Adrian nodded and glanced through the rain-streaked window. Across the street, a neighborhood cafe glowed with warm light, its windows fogged from fresh coffee and baked bread. Near the curb, a young woman wearing a faded blue delivery jacket struggled to keep 3 large food bags from tipping over while balancing an insulated carrier against one shoulder. A sudden gust of wind scattered several printed receipts across the wet sidewalk. Without hesitation, she crouched to gather them before they could blow away, laughing softly at her own bad luck instead of complaining. An elderly man exiting the cafe nearly dropped his cane as he reached for the door. Before thinking about her own deliveries, the young woman hurried over, caught the door with one hand, steadied the gentleman with the other, and waited until he smiled back at her. Only then did she return to the growing stack of orders. Rain soaked strands of light brown hair against her face, but she simply brushed them aside and kept smiling. Adrian had never seen her before. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she lived. He didn't know she was raising a child alone while working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. All he knew was that for the first time in months, someone had completely captured his attention without trying to impress him at all. As the traffic finally began moving again, Adrian found himself still watching the delivery girl through the rear window until the cafe disappeared into the rainy Manhattan night. And for reasons he couldn't explain, the image of her quiet smile refused to leave him. The alarm on Claire Donovan's phone vibrated at 4:30 every morning, long before the first hint of sunlight reached her small apartment in Queens. She never hit the snooze button because every minute mattered. By 4:45, a pot of coffee was brewing while oatmeal simmered quietly on the stove. The apartment was modest, barely 600 square feet, but every corner reflected care instead of complaint. Family photos covered one wall. A second-hand bookshelf held community college textbooks beside children's storybooks. On the refrigerator hung colorful drawings made by 6-year-old Owen, each one signed with oversized letters that proudly read, "Love, Mom's biggest fan." Before waking her son, Claire gently packed his lunch, adding a handwritten note with a tiny smiley face, something she had done every school day since kindergarten. It cost nothing, but Owen insisted the notes made every sandwich taste better. Around his small wrist, he wore a braided leather bracelet that matched the one Claire kept on her own wrist. They had made them together one rainy Saturday using inexpensive craft supplies from a neighborhood dollar store. Owen often called them their lucky bracelets because no matter how difficult a day became, they reminded them they were never facing it alone. By 6:15, Claire dropped Owen off at the apartment of her retired neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who watched him before school every weekday. Claire thanked the older woman with genuine appreciation, never taking kindness for granted. "Go chase your dreams," Mrs. Henderson always said with a warm smile. Claire laughed softly every morning before replying with exactly the same words. "I am. They just happen to be carrying insulated food bags right now." Her first delivery shift started at 7. The city was already alive with construction crews, commuters, cyclists, and coffee drinkers rushing toward another busy day. Claire knew nearly every shortcut in Manhattan, every apartment building with confusing elevators, and every office lobby where security guards greeted her by first name. She remembered customers' favorite breakfast orders without looking at the receipt and always thanked restaurant employees who were working just as hard as she was. Some days brought generous tips. Other days brought none at all. She treated every customer exactly the same. Late that morning, she noticed a young cashier searching every pocket before quietly admitting he had forgotten his wallet. A line immediately formed behind him, and impatient sighs filled the cafe. Without making a scene, Claire stepped forward, smiled, and covered the $12 bill before collecting her own order. "Pay it forward someday," she said simply. The embarrassed cashier thanked her repeatedly while she hurried back outside before anyone could praise her. She never considered herself extraordinary. To Claire, kindness was simply faster than judgment. Around lunchtime, another driver complained loudly about an order that required climbing 6 flights of stairs because the building elevator was broken. Claire offered to switch deliveries without expecting anything in return. By the time she reached the top floor, she was breathing heavily, but the elderly woman who answered the door smiled with grateful eyes and quietly said, "You remind me of my daughter." Those few words stayed with Claire far longer than the modest tip folded into her hand. During a short break, she sat alone on a bench overlooking the East River, eating half of a turkey sandwich while saving the other half for later. Her phone buzzed with a video message from Owen during recess. "Mom, guess what? I got every spelling word right. I told my teacher you always help me practice after dinner. Do not forget movie night tonight." Claire laughed out loud, replaying the message twice before slipping the phone back into her jacket pocket. The exhaustion in her shoulders suddenly felt lighter. She looked at the braided bracelet around her wrist and smiled. It was not expensive. It was not fashionable. Yet to her it was worth more than any luxury watch displayed behind Fifth Avenue storefront windows because it represented the life she was building one honest day at a time. As afternoon clouds rolled over the skyline, Another delivery request appeared on her screen from a neighborhood she rarely visited. Claire accepted it without hesitation, adjusted the insulated bag across her shoulder, and started walking toward an address that seemed perfectly ordinary, never imagining that somewhere else in the same city, a man who could have chosen anyone in the world was already wondering how he could meet the smiling delivery driver one more time. The image of the smiling delivery driver lingered in Adrian Whitmore's mind long after the rain had disappeared from Manhattan. It made no sense to him. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without losing focus for a single minute. Yet one brief glimpse of a stranger had quietly unsettled his perfectly organized routine. 3 mornings later, Adrian stood inside the executive conference room overlooking the Hudson River while senior executives presented quarterly growth projections on a massive screen. Charts climbed higher. Revenue exceeded expectations. Investors were thrilled. Every person around the table waited for Adrian's usual sharp observations. Instead, his attention drifted toward one simple question. Who was she? Ethan noticed immediately. You have barely looked at the presentation. Adrian smiled faintly. I already memorized the numbers before the meeting. Ethan leaned closer after everyone else filed out. Something else is on your mind. Adrian hesitated for a moment before speaking quietly. Have you ever met someone for 5 seconds and felt like they belonged in a completely different world than yours? Ethan laughed. That sounds surprisingly poetic coming from a logistics billionaire. Adrian looked through the glass wall toward the busy streets below. I saw a delivery driver the other night. She stopped everything to help someone without expecting anything back. Nobody was watching. Nobody had a camera. She just did it. Ethan crossed his arms. Then maybe you should thank her instead of wondering about her. Adrian slowly shook his head. If she knows who I am, the moment changes. I will never know whether she is being herself or responding to my reputation. The thought stayed with him all afternoon. By evening, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of returning to his penthouse after work, Adrian drove to a neighborhood clothing store several miles from Midtown. He left his tailored suit inside the car and walked out wearing dark jeans, simple sneakers, a gray hooded sweatshirt, and an inexpensive baseball cap. Without the luxury watch that usually rested on his wrist, he looked like thousands of ordinary New Yorkers finishing another workday. Even his security team stayed several blocks away at his request. For the first time in years, Adrian disappeared into the city without anyone recognizing him. The next step required even more planning. Through his company's delivery platform, he quietly created a personal customer account using a different last name and rented a small furnished apartment in a residential building that employees often used during temporary assignments. It was clean, ordinary, and completely unlike the skyline view from his penthouse. Then he placed a dinner order from a neighborhood restaurant that frequently partnered with the delivery service Claire worked for. His heartbeat felt strangely faster than it had during international business negotiations. 38 minutes later, his phone displayed the notification that a driver had accepted the order. He glanced at the screen. Claire D. His pulse quickened for reasons he could not explain. He stood near the apartment door pretending to organize paperwork while listening for footsteps in the hallway. A gentle knock finally came. Adrian opened the door, and there she was, wearing the same blue delivery jacket, a few loose strands of light brown hair escaping beneath a knit cap, her insulated bag resting comfortably against one shoulder. Good evening, Claire said with the same warm smile he remembered. I have your dinner. I hope the soup stayed hot. The weather is getting colder tonight. Adrian accepted the bag carefully. Thank you. You made great time. Claire laughed softly. I know every shortcut within about 10 miles of here. He noticed the braided leather bracelet around her wrist exactly as he had seen it through the rain days earlier. It looked worn from everyday use, yet she touched it almost absent-mindedly, as though it carried quiet meaning. Long day? Adrian asked naturally. Claire smiled again, tired but genuine. Every day is long. That does not mean it cannot still be a good one. Those simple words caught him completely off guard. Most people answered that question with complaints. She answered it with gratitude. Adrian almost forgot to take the food. Claire politely waited while he signed the digital receipt. I hope you enjoy your dinner, she said before turning toward the hallway. Adrian watched her walk away, then glanced down at the untouched meal in his hands. For the first time in years, he realized he had not ordered dinner because he was hungry. He had ordered it because he wanted one more chance to meet the woman whose quiet kindness felt more valuable than anything money had ever placed in front of him. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian quietly discovered something that no annual report, market analysis, or executive retreat had ever taught him. Character revealed itself in the smallest moments, especially when no one expected to be noticed. He continued placing modest dinner and coffee orders through his temporary customer account, never enough to attract attention, never often enough to seem unusual. Sometimes Claire accepted the delivery. Sometimes another driver did. On the afternoons when her name appeared on his screen, he caught himself smiling before he even realized it. Their conversations remained brief, natural, and wonderfully ordinary. She learned only that his name was Adrian and that he worked remotely as a business consultant. He learned far more without asking many questions because Claire's actions spoke louder than any introduction ever could. One chilly Thursday afternoon, Adrian happened to leave the apartment building just as Claire arrived with another delivery for a neighbor. Before she reached the entrance, an elderly woman carrying 2 heavy grocery bags struggled to climb the front steps. Without a second of hesitation, Claire set the insulated food bags safely against the wall, hurried over, lifted both grocery bags, and slowly walked beside the woman all the way to her apartment door on the 3rd floor. She returned several minutes later slightly out of breath, apologized to the customer for the short delay, and smiled as though helping someone had been the easiest decision in the world. Not once did she mention what she had done. Not once did she expect anyone to thank her. Adrian watched quietly from across the sidewalk, realizing that kindness had become her instinct rather than her strategy. A few days later, he visited a neighborhood coffee shop where he had learned many delivery drivers stopped between orders. Claire stood near the register chatting with another driver whose expression looked worried. The young man searched every pocket before admitting he had forgotten his wallet again. Before he could finish apologizing, Claire placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Take care of lunch today," she said. "You can help someone else when you have the chance." The driver tried to refuse, but Claire gently shook her head. Everybody needs a little grace sometimes. Adrian quietly ordered his own coffee without interrupting the moment. When Claire noticed him sitting near the window, she walked over with a cheerful smile. "Business consultant, right?" she asked playfully. Adrian laughed. "You remembered." "I try to remember friendly customers," she replied. "It makes New York feel a little smaller." They spoke for only a few minutes before another delivery notification appeared on her phone. She excused herself immediately, thanking the barista before hurrying back into the cold afternoon. Adrian remained seated long after she left, staring into his untouched coffee. He had attended networking breakfasts where people spent hours trying to impress one another. Claire had impressed him more in 5 minutes simply by treating strangers with respect. As the days passed, he noticed another pattern. Every evening around 7, regardless of how busy she seemed, Claire found a quiet place to make a short video call. Once, while waiting outside a restaurant for an order, Adrian unintentionally overheard part of the conversation. "Did you finish reading tonight?" she asked with unmistakable warmth in her voice. A little boy answered excitedly from the phone, proudly holding up a drawing covered with bright crayons. Adrian could not hear every word, but he heard enough to understand. Claire was a mother, and every ounce of exhaustion she carried throughout the day disappeared the moment she looked at her son. She ended the call by touching the braided leather bracelet on her wrist and smiling. "I will be home before bedtime. Save me one goodnight hug." The call ended, and she immediately accepted another delivery request without complaining about the extra hours. Adrian looked away before she noticed him. Suddenly, the bracelet made sense. It was not simply jewelry. It was a promise she carried with her everywhere she went. That evening, Ethan called while Adrian walked back toward the temporary apartment. "You have declined 3 dinner invitations this week," Ethan said suspiciously. "Should I be worried?" Adrian smiled to himself. "Not worried. Then what should I be?" Adrian glanced toward the busy street where delivery scooters disappeared into the city lights. "Curious," he answered softly, "because I think I just met the first person in years who measures success in completely different ways than I do. And somehow I cannot stop wanting to understand her world." As autumn settled over New York, Adrian found himself arranging his schedule around moments that no board meeting could justify. He no longer measured his evenings by investor calls or financial forecasts. Instead, He quietly hoped the next notification on his phone would display Claire's name. What surprised him even more was that he had stopped thinking about why. He simply enjoyed being around someone who never seemed to perform for the world. One rainy Tuesday, he ordered a cup of hot coffee instead of dinner, choosing a small neighborhood cafe only a few blocks from the temporary apartment. 25 minutes later, Claire stepped inside, carrying the paper cup carefully in both hands to keep it warm. Tiny drops of rain sparkled across her blue jacket, and loose strands of hair framed her smiling face. "Perfect timing," Adrian said as he accepted the drink. Claire laughed softly. "Actually, I was worried it might cool down because traffic was terrible." Adrian looked at the untouched second cup resting on a nearby table. "Would you have 5 minutes before your next delivery?" She glanced at her phone, then back at him. "I have exactly 6. He smiled. "Then I will not waste them." They sat near the window while rain tapped gently against the glass. Adrian asked about the city, her favorite neighborhoods, and the hidden restaurants only delivery drivers seemed to know. Claire answered easily, describing family-owned diners, tiny bakeries, and coffee shops where the owners always remembered regular customers by name. She never mentioned celebrities or expensive places. To her, the best restaurant in New York was simply the one where people treated each other kindly. Before leaving, she picked up both empty cups and thanked the employees behind the counter even though they had only done their jobs. Adrian noticed every small gesture. A few days later, temperatures dropped nearly 15 degrees overnight. Adrian stepped outside carrying 2 fresh cups of hot chocolate just as Claire arrived with another delivery in the neighborhood. She looked surprised. "One of these was definitely not on my order." Adrian smiled. "It is not. I remembered you said cold weather makes the scooter rides twice as long." Claire accepted the drink with both hands, grateful more for the thought than the beverage itself. "Nobody has ever brought me hot chocolate during work before." Adrian shrugged modestly. "Maybe somebody should have." They stood on the sidewalk talking for only a few minutes before another delivery alert appeared on her phone. Claire sighed with a playful smile. "Duty calls." She climbed onto her scooter, waved goodbye, and disappeared into the evening traffic. Adrian remained standing there far longer than necessary, realizing that he had been looking forward to making someone else's day a little easier. It was a feeling money had never given him. Their conversations gradually became more personal without either of them noticing. Claire spoke about growing up with parents who believed that honesty was worth more than comfort. She admitted life had not unfolded exactly as she once imagined, but she refused to let disappointment become her identity. "My son watches everything I do," she said one evening while waiting for a restaurant to finish an order. "If I become bitter, he will think that is how adults are supposed to live. I would rather teach him gratitude, even on difficult days." Adrian listened quietly. Those words stayed with him long after they said goodbye. He wanted to tell her that she was teaching another adult the same lesson, but he kept the thought to himself. Claire, meanwhile, found herself thinking about the quiet business consultant more often than she expected. He never interrupted when she spoke. He never looked distracted by his phone. He always thanked restaurant workers, held doors open for strangers, and treated every conversation as though it mattered. She had met plenty of successful people during deliveries, but Adrian felt different. There was a calmness about him that made long days seem shorter. One evening, as Claire prepared to leave after another delivery, Adrian noticed the familiar braided bracelet slipping beneath her jacket sleeve. "That bracelet must be very special," he said gently. Claire smiled with unmistakable affection. "My son made it for me. He says as long as I wear it, I will always find my way home." Adrian looked at the simple leather braid for several quiet seconds before replying. "He sounds like a very wise little boy." Claire laughed. "He definitely thinks he is." As she rode away beneath the glowing streetlights, Adrian instinctively touched his own empty wrist. For the first time in his life, he found himself wishing that the most valuable thing he owned could not be purchased in a jewelry store or displayed inside a glass case. Somewhere deep inside, feelings he had never planned for were beginning to grow, and neither of them realized that the truth waiting just around the corner would soon test everything they had quietly built together. The following Friday began like every other workday for Claire, with early deliveries, crowded sidewalks, and a carefully planned schedule that left almost no room for delays. By late afternoon, her delivery application assigned her one final priority order before she could head home to Owen. The destination surprised her. Whitmore Logistics Group headquarters. She frowned for a moment, recognizing the company name from countless delivery trucks she saw every day throughout the city, but she thought nothing more of it. A delivery was simply a delivery. She secured the insulated carrier on her shoulder and navigated through midtown traffic until a breathtaking glass tower stretched high above the surrounding buildings. Employees dressed in tailored suits streamed through the revolving doors, while sleek black vehicles lined the curb outside. Claire checked the address twice before stepping inside. The elegant marble lobby felt worlds away from the neighborhood cafes and apartment buildings where she usually worked. A smiling receptionist greeted her politely. "Good afternoon. Delivery for the executive conference floor." Claire nodded and accepted a temporary visitor badge. "Someone will escort you upstairs," the receptionist explained. Within minutes, an elevator carried Claire toward the top of the building. The higher it climbed, the more she wondered what kind of meeting required dinner before sunset. The elevator doors opened into an expansive executive floor where quiet conversations blended with the soft music drifting through a beautifully decorated reception area. Large digital screens displayed photographs celebrating the company's newest nationwide community initiative. Claire followed an assistant toward a spacious ballroom where hundreds of guests were gathering. Before she crossed the entrance, applause suddenly erupted across the room. Curious, she instinctively turned toward the enormous stage at the front of the ballroom. The giant screen illuminated with a familiar face. Adrian Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer. Claire stopped walking so abruptly that the assistant beside her almost bumped into her shoulder. Her heartbeat seemed to disappear for one impossible second before returning twice as fast. No, that could not be right. The man smiling confidently on the screen wore an impeccably tailored navy suit instead of a gray sweatshirt and jeans. Yet the warm eyes were unmistakable. The calm smile was the same one that had greeted her over cups of coffee, quiet conversations, and rainy afternoons. Another wave of applause filled the ballroom as Adrian stepped onto the stage. "Please welcome our founder, Adrian Whitmore." Claire could barely hear the introduction. Every conversation they had shared replayed inside her mind all at once. The business consultant, the temporary apartment, the ordinary customer who always asked thoughtful questions. None of it suddenly made sense anymore. She stood frozen beside the ballroom entrance while Adrian began speaking about opportunity, community partnerships, and the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of position or income. His words sounded exactly like the man she had come to know, but now every sentence carried a truth he had never shared with her. Claire lowered her eyes to the visitor badge clipped to her jacket. She felt unexpectedly embarrassed, not because she had spent time with a billionaire, but because she realized he had known everything about their difference in circumstances while she had known almost nothing about him. Had every conversation been some kind of experiment? Had he been observing her all along? The assistant quietly whispered, "Miss, the catering coordinator is waiting for the delivery." Claire blinked, forcing herself to move. She completed the delivery with practiced professionalism, thanked the staff, and hurried back toward the elevator before anyone noticed the confusion written across her face. Just as the elevator doors began closing, she heard a familiar voice from across the lobby. "Claire." Adrian had spotted her the moment she turned away from the ballroom. Without thinking, he excused himself from several executives and walked quickly toward the elevators. Their eyes met for only a brief moment before the doors slid shut between them. Claire stood inside the descending elevator, gripping the braided bracelet around her wrist so tightly that her fingers trembled. She did not know which feeling hurt more: the fact that Adrian Whitmore was one of the richest men in America, or the realization that the man she had slowly begun to trust had hidden the biggest truth about himself from the very beginning. Claire barely remembered how she reached the sidewalk outside Whitmore Logistics headquarters. The cold evening air should have cleared her thoughts, but every step only made them heavier. Yellow taxis rolled past, office workers hurried toward the subway, and the city continued exactly as it had every other Friday, unaware that her world had quietly shifted. She unlocked her scooter with trembling hands before stopping. She could not drive yet, not until she understood what she was feeling. It was not anger because Adrian was wealthy. She had delivered meals to successful people every day. Wealth had never impressed or offended her. It was the silence that hurt. Every conversation they had shared suddenly felt wrapped inside a question she had never been allowed to ask. Had he been watching her? Testing her? Waiting to see whether she would act differently if she knew his last name? She looked down at the braided bracelet around her wrist and whispered almost to herself, "Trust should never feel like a surprise." Her phone vibrated. Adrian. She stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. A second later, a message appeared. "Please let me explain." Claire slipped the phone back into her pocket without replying. She needed to go home. She needed to see Owen. She needed something in her evening that still felt honest. By the time she arrived at her apartment, Owen ran straight into her arms with the same joyful smile he wore every day. "Mom, I saved dessert for you." Claire hugged him tightly, almost too tightly, burying her face against his hair for a quiet moment before forcing herself to smile. They ate dinner together, practiced spelling words, and watched half of their Friday movie before Owen finally drifted to sleep on the couch. Only then did Claire allow herself to think about Adrian again. She remembered every cup of coffee, every thoughtful question, every conversation that had slowly lowered the walls around her heart. None of those memories felt fake. Yet one truth remained impossible to ignore. He had known exactly who he was from the beginning. She had not. Across Manhattan, Adrian sat alone inside his penthouse for what felt like the first time since moving back from the temporary apartment. The skyline that once represented everything he had built now looked strangely distant. His dinner remained untouched on the kitchen counter, while Ethan quietly entered carrying several documents for Monday's board meeting. One look at Adrian's face told him those papers would remain unopened. "She found out," Ethan said softly. Adrian nodded. "She looked at me as though she had never met me before." Ethan pulled out a chair. "Did you lie to her?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "I never invented another life. I just chose not to tell her mine." Ethan remained silent for a moment before asking the harder question. "And why did you hide it?" Adrian looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the endless city lights below. "Because I wanted one person to speak to me without seeing headlines, stock prices, or my last name first. I wanted to know whether genuine connection still existed." He paused before adding quietly, "But I forgot that honesty works both ways." Those words settled heavily between them. The following morning, Adrian returned to the neighborhood cafe where they had shared countless short conversations. He ordered the same hot chocolate Claire liked, hoping by chance she might walk through the door. She never did. He visited again the next afternoon, and again 2 days later. The employees began recognizing him, but Claire had changed her delivery routes after requesting a different district earlier that weekend. She was not trying to punish him. She simply needed distance before her heart confused kindness with trust again. Days passed. Adrian found himself checking the delivery application only to remember that Claire no longer appeared in his neighborhood. He realized something painful. During his entire career, every obstacle had been solved through strategy, influence, or resources. This one could not. There was no business solution for a wounded heart. No contract could repair broken trust. No amount of money could purchase another first impression. Standing outside the cafe one cold evening, Adrian quietly reached into his pocket and noticed the paper sleeve from the first hot chocolate he had bought for Claire weeks earlier. Somehow he had never thrown it away. He smiled sadly at the memory before looking toward the busy street where hundreds of delivery drivers continued weaving through traffic beneath the glowing city lights. For the first time in many years, the man who had built an empire delivering millions of packages every day understood that the one thing he truly wanted could never arrive unless he was willing to carry it himself. Monday morning arrived with freezing rain and gray skies stretching across New York. Claire woke before dawn feeling unusually tired after spending most of the night caring for Owen, who had developed a high fever over the weekend. Although his condition had improved, the doctor recommended keeping him home for another day. Claire called every babysitter she knew, but no one was available on such short notice. Mrs. Henderson had an important medical appointment she could not miss. Claire looked at her delivery schedule, then at her sleeping son. Missing an entire day of work meant losing money she had already planned for rent and groceries. Going to work was impossible. Staying home felt unavoidable. She quietly opened the delivery application and reluctantly marked every scheduled route as unavailable. Across the city, Adrian sat in his office preparing for another week of executive meetings when Ethan entered carrying a tablet. Operations just flagged an unusual situation, Ethan explained. One of our highest-rated delivery partners canceled every route this morning because of a family emergency. The system is scrambling to reassign everything. Adrian looked toward the screen, and the familiar name immediately caught his attention. Claire Donovan. Without another word, he stood up, removed his tailored suit jacket, and reached for the simple clothes he had kept folded in his office since leaving the temporary apartment. Ethan watched in confusion. "Where exactly are you going?" Adrian answered while pulling on the same gray hooded sweatshirt he had worn weeks earlier. "To finish something I should have understood from the beginning." 40 minutes later, Adrian reported to one of Whitmore Logistics' neighborhood distribution centers under his employee identification, requesting permission to personally assist with overflow deliveries. The warehouse manager stared in disbelief until Adrian quietly insisted that no special treatment was needed. Soon he was loading insulated bags into an ordinary delivery van alongside dozens of workers who had no idea the company's founder was joining their route. The first few stops seemed simple enough. By the fourth apartment building, Adrian understood why Claire always looked exhausted. Parking was impossible. Elevators were slow. Apartment numbers never followed a logical order. Customers expected friendly smiles even when schedules slipped behind. Rain soaked through his shoes after climbing flights of narrow stairs carrying heavy grocery bags. His shoulders ached before noon. Yet, every time frustration threatened to surface, he remembered Claire thanking restaurant workers, encouraging nervous cashiers, and smiling through much longer days than this. He realized she had never complained because she had never viewed people as interruptions. She viewed them as neighbors. During one delivery, an elderly man apologized repeatedly for taking extra time to answer the door. Adrian instinctively smiled. "Please do not worry. Take all the time you need." The grateful expression on the man's face reminded Adrian of something Claire once said. "Everybody needs a little grace sometimes." By late afternoon, Adrian quietly completed every route originally assigned to Claire. Before returning the van, he stopped at a neighborhood grocery store and purchased fresh soup, fruit, children's medicine, and several simple meals that could easily be reheated. He carried the bags to Claire's apartment building but hesitated outside her door. He did not want his gesture to feel like another attempt to impress her. So he placed everything neatly beside the entrance with a handwritten note. There was no company logo, no expensive gift, no signature boasting about who he was. The note simply read, "You spend every day taking care of strangers. Today someone wanted to take care of you. I finally understand how much strength your ordinary days require. Thank you for teaching me that kindness is work, not convenience. I hope Owen feels better soon. Adrian." A few hours later, Claire opened the apartment door after putting Owen down for an afternoon nap. She looked at the grocery bags in complete surprise before noticing the folded note resting on top. As she slowly read every word, tears quietly filled her eyes. Not because of the groceries, not because of the medicine, but because for the first time since discovering the truth, Adrian had not tried to explain himself with wealth or influence. Instead, he had stepped into her world, carried the same heavy bags, climbed the same endless stairs, worked the same exhausting hours, and finally understood the life she had never asked anyone to rescue. Claire gently touched the braided bracelet around her wrist, folded the note with unexpected care, and for the first time since walking out of Whitmore Logistics headquarters, she wondered whether the man who had hidden his identity had also become the man willing to change because of the truth she had quietly lived every single day. 3 days later, the rain finally gave way to a brilliant blue sky, and the first hints of winter sunlight painted New York with a quiet warmth that seemed almost symbolic. Claire returned to work after Owen had fully recovered, carrying the same insulated delivery bag and wearing the same braided bracelet that never left her wrist. Life looked exactly as it had before, yet something inside her had changed. Adrian's handwritten note had remained folded carefully inside her jacket pocket ever since that morning. She had read it more times than she wanted to admit. Not because it erased the pain of his hidden identity, but because every word reflected something she had never expected from a billionaire. Understanding, humility, growth. That afternoon, another delivery request appeared on her screen, this time to the neighborhood cafe where they had shared so many quiet conversations. Claire hesitated for only a moment before accepting it. When she pushed open the familiar cafe door, She immediately saw Adrian sitting near the window, not wearing an expensive suit, not surrounded by assistants or security, simply waiting with 2 cups of hot chocolate resting on the table between them. He stood as she approached, but did not move closer. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. Claire placed the delivery on the counter before turning toward him. For several quiet seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "I have replayed our first conversation 1,000 times. At first I believed I was protecting something valuable. Then I realized I was protecting the wrong thing." Claire looked at him calmly. "You should have trusted me with the truth." Adrian nodded without hesitation. "You are right. I wanted someone to know me before my last name. But I forgot that real trust begins when both people are equally honest." He reached into his jacket and carefully placed something on the table. It was the paper sleeve from the first hot chocolate he had bought her weeks earlier. "I kept this because it reminded me of the first day I stopped measuring life by achievements." Claire smiled faintly, surprised that he had saved something so ordinary. Adrian continued quietly. "I spent years building the fastest delivery company in the country. Millions of packages reached their destinations because of me. But the most valuable thing ever delivered into my life was never inside a box." He looked directly into her eyes. "It was the kindness you carried with you every single day." Claire felt her heart soften. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the handwritten note he had left outside her apartment. "I kept this too," she admitted. "Not because of the groceries. Because it was the first time I felt you were speaking as Adrian instead of as someone trying to impress me." Adrian smiled with quiet relief. "Then may I spend the rest of my life making sure those 2 people are finally the same?" Before Claire could answer, a familiar little voice interrupted from behind. "Mom." Owen ran into the cafe after Mrs. Henderson brought him inside, waving excitedly toward Adrian. "You are the hot chocolate man." Adrian laughed for the first time in days and knelt to Owen's height. "I guess I am." Owen looked at his mother before whispering loudly enough for both adults to hear. "He smiles like a nice person." Claire could not help laughing. Children often notice truths adults overlooked. 1 year later, Whitmore Logistics celebrated the opening of a new nationwide community program created not by executives alone, but by delivery drivers themselves. The initiative provided emergency childcare assistance, educational scholarships, and flexible scheduling for working parents across the company's entire network. Adrian insisted that the people who understood those challenges best should help design every solution. Claire became the program's director, respected not because of who she loved, but because of the compassion and practical wisdom she brought every single day. On the anniversary of the program's launch, employees gathered in the same neighborhood cafe where everything had quietly begun. Adrian reached into his pocket and removed a simple ring. It was elegant but understated, nothing designed to attract attention. "Claire," he said gently, "the greatest investment I have ever made was believing that kindness deserves honesty. Will you build the rest of this life with me?" Tears filled her eyes as she glanced down at the braided bracelet still resting on her wrist. She slipped it off for the first time in years and tied it gently around Adrian's wrist instead. "Now you will always find your way home too," she whispered before saying yes. As applause filled the little cafe, Adrian looked at the leather bracelet with quiet gratitude. The billionaire who had once walked away from glamour without feeling anything finally understood that real wealth had never been waiting inside boardrooms, luxury ballrooms, or headlines. It had been waiting inside ordinary days, shared cups of hot chocolate, honest hearts, and the courage to become worthy of the love that money could never buy. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.